Another significant change that happens in the Episcopal Church is the approval of women's ordination at the 1976 General Convention. This is one of the watershed moments of the life of the Episcopal Church. The history of this movement, we could perhaps begin with the 1964 General Convention, which approves a canon that states that deaconesses are not set apart for ministry, but rather are ordered for ministry. By using that language of ordering, they're suggesting that they fit somewhere within the threefold order of ministry of bishop, presbyter, and deacon. This question of women's ordination is revolving in part because there had been the ordination of a woman in Hong Kong during World War II, Frances Lee Tim Oy, who serves with the permission of the Archbishop of Canterbury as a presbyter. She was forced to resign her position at the end of World War II, but the fact that she has been an active priest makes this an issue for the Anglican Communion as a whole to continue to consider. So the 1968 Lambeth Conference also affirms that women are deacons and refers the question of whether women can be ordained to the priesthood back to the provinces of the communion for more study. And so what happens next in the life of the Episcopal Church is really part of a process of trying to discern with the rest of the communion about the nature of women in ministry. Now, one of the significant things to also note here is that it's only in 1970 that women are even permitted to serve as lay deputies at General Convention. There had been effort for women to serve as deputies for several decades, but the resistance to that comes from male deputies. As a voting bloc, it was the male deputies who prevented canonical changes to allow female deputies from the 1940s to the 1960s. That is, in other words, the House of Bishops was willing to approve female deputies. Ordained clergy serving as deputies were willing to approve of this. It was only the male, and we have to say predominantly white male deputies who were refusing this. So, but with the shift of the presence of female deputies at the 1970 General Convention, this also helps push along the question of women's ordination. So what happens is at the 1970 General Convention, there's also an elimination of a distinction between male deacons and female deacons, thus opening the door for any woman to be ordained as a deacon, and quite a number of already ordered deaconesses simply transfer to being deacons. Furthermore, there's a study presented to General Convention that declares there's no theological grounds to prevent the ordination of women to the priesthood. But a resolution affirming this is defeated at General Convention. Advocates for women's ordination submit a resolution. It's approved by bishops and laity, but is defeated by clergy by a vote of orders at the 1970 General Convention. Supporters expect that at the 1973 General Convention, women's ordination will pass. Meanwhile, in 1971, the Anglican Consultative Council, which is a new body in the Anglican Communion that's designed to help pull the different provinces of the communion together to consult on pressing issues of their common life. It is representative of the various provinces of the communion. This council approves the idea of the ordination of women if local provinces do support it. Hong Kong responds by beginning to ordain women in the early 1970s. So this is significant. The first place where an ordained woman for priest had appeared in the communion is the first place to also go back to this practice. In 1972, the House of Bishops of the Episcopal Church also issues a statement approving the concept of women's ordination to the priesthood. So there's lots of signals that this is about to go forward in the Episcopal Church at General Convention in 1973. Prior to the holding of the General Convention in 1973 in Louisville, 27 diocesan conventions had voted in favor of women's ordination. 42 female deacons have been ordained since 1970, which shows a real groundswell of anticipation that the ordination of women to the priesthood is going to happen. But at the General Convention in Louisville, the ordination of women resolution fails, even though a majority vote in favor, because there are a high degree of split delegation votes. Okay, so this is back to some technicalities around canon law. When there's going to be a canonical change, a vote by orders occurs. And so that means that your diocesan deputations have 4 clergy and 4 laity in each deputation. So they vote separately. What happened was a number of deputations are split, whether yes or no to ordaining women. According to the Constitution of the Episcopal Church, a split delegation vote counts as a no vote. So, even though a raw number majority had voted in favor of women's ordination, there were enough split delegation votes to actually push the defeat of the resolution. This is a massive disappointment to supporters of women's ordination. And this leads to organized planning to ordain female candidates by sympathetic bishops. That is essentially to not wait another 3 years for their vote, but to go ahead and to push for what we would call an irregular ordination of women to the priesthood. There are a core of advocates for this, led by a network of female leadership who have been radicalized and are going to push for change outside of what Carter Hayward calls the conventional system. Carter Hayward ends up being one of the first women ordained to the priesthood, and is a professor at Episcopal Theological School, soon to be Episcopal Divinity School in Cambridge, Massachusetts. So Carter Hayward, reflecting on this moment in time, notes, quote, whereas prayer book revision, which was also up for debate at this time and had been going forward, whereas prayer book revision is a matter of taste or preference, women's ordination is a matter of justice. So Carter Hayward is really pushing the justice angle for this. Polly Murray, who is going to be the first female African-American priest, writes in a letter to her bishop, Paul Moore of the Diocese of New York. And you have this in a PDF from the archives of the diocese that I've shared with you. And she is reflecting on a conference about women's ordination that was held at Virginia Theological Seminary. She writes, the women were speaking to the ethics and morality of the church. That's very similar to how Carter Hayward is framing this. And the men were speaking to the politics of the church. The division at this point was so clear that it was almost as if the men and women were speaking separate languages. And this really gets to the heart of what's happening with that those split delegations and voting by orders, is that there appear to be men who are concerned about what it will do to the life of the church if women are ordained, to treat women's ordination as a problem that has to be resolved rather than as a necessity that has to be met, which is how Hayward and Murray are framing it. It's interesting, that letter to Bishop Moore, that Polly Murray further reflects on an intersectional dynamic she sees in the women's ordination movement for herself as a Black woman, between what she had learned and observed in the Black male-led civil rights movement, of which she was a primary mover, especially around some of its legal architecture, and what she's seeing in a white female-led ordination movement, and she is trying to find her place in that and where her voice is as a number of things: a woman, a black person, an Episcopalian, a seminarian, worth reflecting on in that letter to see where she positions herself. Nonetheless, what we're seeing here in this movement is a shift from wanting to cooperate with the canonical power structures to claiming the power of individual conscience. This is a very Protestant move to say it's the individual conscience that's really going to push us on towards a moment of crisis that will force some kind of choosing within the life of the church. This leads to a development of a rationale for ordinations without canonical approval. This is designed by a number of people: Carol Anderson, Suzanne Hyatt, who is also another faculty member at Episcopal Divinity School, Henry Ryder, who is at Virginia Theological Seminary, William Stringfellow, who is a prolific lay Episcopalian theologian. They argue that the canons do not explicitly prohibit the ordination of women. There's nowhere in the canons to say women can't be ordained. And they also make the argument, which is observed, that in the canons there is a male language, but the male language is understood to be generic. This is a common argument in this time period. Male gendered language that is addressed in general to people ought to be understood to include men and women. Thus, they're turning some of the sexist gendered logic on its head and saying, we can actually find space in here for women to be ordained. And thus, by this reading, the ordination canons apply to all people. They also make the argument, which is more of a moral argument, that since the majority of votes at both the General Conventions of 1970 and 1973 supported ordination, it really is not going against the mind of the church to proceed with them. This leads to the day of July 29th, 1974, where 11 women are ordained to the priesthood in Philadelphia by Bishops DeWitt, Corrigan, and Wells, all retired bishops. Now, everyone knows this is going to happen. This is not a secret. Everyone who is involved in these debates is aware that this is going to occur. Presiding Bishop Allen actually calls the organizers and participants and asks them to cancel the ordination, but they refuse. These people are ordained according to the 1928 American Prayer Book Rite. And this service is portrayed by people as a prophetic action that follows the model of the civil rights movement, that acting for justice, even in a civilly or canonically disobedient manner, is more important than due process and gradualism. And so we have a quote from Carter Hayward. This is from her own biography, A Priest Forever, written in 1976. It's on page 599 of Arbentrout and Slocum. She writes, "I do not offer any peculiar brand of softness or sweetness, seductiveness or saintliness to the Episcopal Church." That is, she doesn't offer all these gendered expectations of being a woman as a priest. She says instead, "I offer myself, my softness, my toughness, my sweetness, my bitterness, my seductiveness, my honesty, my saintliness, and my sinfulness to the church. As a woman, together with my sisters, I offer a difference, a different ethic, derived from collective exclusion, which will help build on behalf of other outsiders." This is signaling there. "A different visual, audible, sensory image I'll help create. A different theology I'll help shape. A different priesthood in which I've been ordained. Indeed, a different Episcopal Church as one manifestation of Catholic Christendom. For those who feared that women's ordination was going to lead to a radical change in the life of the Episcopal Church, Carter Hayward is saying, yes, precisely. Once we have women ordained, we're going to start asking who else is not ordained yet. Once we have white women ordained, we'll ask, where are the other women of color, as Polly Murray asked to Bishop Moore in her letter. Once we have apparently straight women ordained, we'll ask, where are the women who love other women, queer women, lesbian women? And it turns out that Carter Hayward and Suzanne Hyatt are those very people, actually. And so there is this ongoing question of how women's ordination is going to radically transform the church. And it's worth pulling back and asking what transforms the church more? What happens with the special program of General Convention? Or what happens with the women's ordination movement? As a result, the House of Bishops goes into an emergency meeting that Bishop Allen convenes, and they declare that these ordinations that have occurred are invalid. They realize that actually they have no canonical grounds for declaring that they're invalid because, well, 3 bishops ordained these people. Later they say it's an irregular ordination. And the issue really isn't that women were ordained, but that the 3 bishops who do the ordaining, DeWitt, Corrigan, and Wells, have violated the collegiality of the House of Bishops. They had violated due process. And that is where the real institutional problem lies. As I've already noted, 2 of the Philadelphia 11, Suzanne Hyatt and Carter Hayward, are appointed to Episcopal Divinity School faculty soon afterwards. On September 7th, 1975, Bishop Barrett, also retired, ordains 4 women in Washington, D.C. In 1976, at the General Convention, there is a vote to recognize women are eligible to be ordained to all orders, effectively on January 1st, 1977. Note that they don't say women are only eligible to be ordained deacon and priest. They simply say all orders, which means implicitly by 1976, the idea that women can also be bishops is approved canonically. However, there's a request made that the women ordained in Philadelphia and Washington be ordained or regularized in a public service. Now, they can't be ordained again, and none of these women assent to this regularized service, but it's worth noting that this is a request made. There is a meeting of the House of Bishops in Port St. Lucie in September of 1977. There is a lot of tension in the House of Bishops. There are congregations defecting and splitting off from the Episcopal Church, both because of this and because of the looming introduction of the new Book of Common Prayer that will be made canonical at the 1979 General Convention. It's also well known that presiding Bishop Allen is personally opposed to the ordination of women, and there's a question for him about his leadership. And so I've given you a PDF, which is a letter that Bishop Allen writes to the House of Bishops. This is on page 11 of that document. It says, thus, in the middle, thus far my understanding of Christian priesthood, of the interrelatedness of the Christian ministry of New Testament imagery and symbolism, of the roles and interrelations of human sexuality, prevent my believing that women can be priests any more than they can become fathers or husbands. At the same time, my mind holds no questions or doubt as to the rights and abilities of women to be elders, rulers, executives, generals, presidents, judges, or queens. The fact simply stated is, to date, I remain unconvinced that women can be priests. So he goes on. If it's determined by prayerful authority that this limitation prevents one from serving as the presiding bishop of this church, I am willing to resign the office. The ministry must be offered voluntarily, as the offering can only be accepted voluntarily and never upon the demand of the minister. So here Allen is posing the question, do you still want me to lead this church? He asks the House of Bishops. Do you want me leading this church knowing where I stand on this question? The House of Bishops responds that they do want him. And they go further to note that every bishop of the Episcopal Church ought to be able to exercise their own conscience regarding women's ordination, whether they should either be condemned for refusing ordination of women or condemned for supporting it. And so the House of Bishops offer a statement essentially on this issue of conscience, and that this is what bishops can be held by. The problem is there's no binding mechanism for this so-called conscience clause. It's not passed at any general convention, and so ironically, this conscience clause regarding canonical change has no actual canonical standing. And this really challenges the ecclesiology of the Episcopal Church, which is based upon a consensual agreement between the two houses of General Convention and the cooperation of the diocese with them. This is something we're going to keep on paying attention to as we turn to the developments around human sexuality in the Episcopal Church in a few weeks. By the end of 1977, there are about 100 female priests. By 1979, there are more than 300 female priests in 72 out of the 93 dioceses. This shows that there was pent-up demand for the ordination of women, and really a rapid acceptance of them into most of the life of the church. However, we have about 20% of the church that is holding out against women's ordination by the end of the 1970s. You might be from one of those dioceses that historically held this position. It's worth noting some of the other significant firsts around women's ordination in this time period. In 1977, as I've noted before, the Reverend Polly Murray is ordained the first female African-American priest. In 1979, the Reverend Nina Olmedo Jacund is ordained the first Latina priest. In 1985, the Reverend Fran Toy is ordained the first female Asian priest. I must say it's been a personal blessing of my own to have gotten to know Fran Toy while I was living in California. In February of 1989, Barbara Harris is consecrated as a suffragan bishop of Massachusetts. And I have linked to you this week in Populi a podcast between her and Dr. Catherine Meeks, which is a really great interview to listen to. In 1993, Mary McLeod is elected the first female diocesan bishop for the Diocese of Vermont. In between there, we have the election of Penny Jameson as the first diocesan bishop of the Anglican Communion for New Zealand. It's only in 1997 that General Convention rules that the objection to the ordination of women is canonically invalid. So some of the holdout dioceses, like the Diocese of Fort Worth and of Quincy, and a few other places, El Camino, Diocese of San Joaquin, they have to go ahead with women's ordination now. This ruling is part of what is going to cause those dioceses of Fort Worth, Quincy, and San Joaquin to begin to think about leaving the Episcopal Church. The consecration of Gene Robinson just 6 years later in 2003
is going to be part of what really sends them further away from the life of the Episcopal Church, at least through its leadership and some of its members. We'll get to more of that in a few weeks. A lot for us to consider here. I look forward to our discussions.